A calculus professor tried to humiliate the quiet man in the back row, unaware he was a math genius in disguise. What began as a public takedown spiraled into an intellectual showdown that left an entire university stunned. By the time she learned who he really was, it was already too late. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning air clung to the stone walls of the Hartsdale Institute of Mathematics like breath to glass. It was the kind of cold that sharpened your focus, a reminder that this was no ordinary place. Cobblestone paths wound between towering academic buildings, their windows glowing faintly under a pale September sun. Ivy curled around limestone pillars like time itself, and bronze plaques, beneath sculptures of long-dead thinkers, bore the weight of legacy. Every step on that campus felt like a test. Inside Lecture Hall B17, tension built quietly. It was the first day of advanced multivariable calculus, a course feared even by the most brilliant minds on campus. Students filed in with cautious energy, clinging to their coffee cups and syllabi like armor. Whispered introductions floated across the room. Most of them were juniors or seniors, math majors with GPAs to protect and scholarships on the line. At the front of the room, scrawled in elegant serif chalk, were 5 words that made several students swallow hard. Advanced Multivariable Calculus, Professor Lilith Mercer. The name alone carried weight. Mercer wasn't just a mathematician, she was a gatekeeper. Known for publishing dense theoretical papers that baffled even grad students, she was revered and feared in equal measure. Her lectures were fast, her exams brutal. She had once brought a student to tears for mislabeling a matrix transformation. She called it intellectual correction. Others called it academic cruelty. She didn't smile, she didn't soften, she didn't accept excuses. If you passed her class, you earned it, with every sleepless night and every corrected mistake. But most didn't pass. Some dropped out within the first month. Her name was practically a warning label. The atmosphere was already tight when the large double doors at the back of the lecture hall creaked open slowly. No one looked at first. Most assumed it was just another latecomer trying not to draw attention. But something about the rhythm of the footsteps made a few students glance up. A man stepped into the room, taller than most, dressed in black jeans and a plain charcoal t-shirt under a well-worn leather jacket. His hair was slightly tousled, and he carried no backpack. Just a thick black notebook, edges frayed, corners curled. No laptop, no tablet, no phone, just pen and paper. He moved with quiet purpose, choosing a seat in the last row. He didn't look around, didn't speak. He simply sat, opened the notebook, and flipped to a marked page. As if he had been here before. A ripple of awareness passed through the rows. One girl nudged her friend with her elbow. The friend followed her gaze and whispered with disbelief. Wait, is that? The other girl blinked, eyes wide. No way! It was him, Keanu Reeves. No one moved. No one dared to speak above a whisper. A few students glanced again just to be sure they weren't hallucinating. There was no mistaking him. The man who had faced down agents in slow motion. The man who had ridden horses through city streets. The man whose face was instantly recognizable, yet now looked strangely at peace among chalkboards and half-erased equations. Some expected him to offer an explanation, maybe smile sheepishly or wave to ease the tension. But he did none of that. Keanu sat perfectly still, flipping to a fresh page in his notebook, pen in hand, eyes already focused on the blackboard. Whatever brought him here, it wasn't attention. And then the room shifted. The door at the front opened with sharp finality. High heels echoed across the polished wooden floor. A storm had entered the room. Professor Lilith Mercer. She wore a slate gray suit, tailored so precisely it might have been drawn with a compass. Her posture was straight as a ruler, hair pinned back, not a strand out of place. Her eyes, cold and calculating, swept across the room like scanners at a security checkpoint. Her presence wasn't just authoritative, it was surgical. She didn't speak at first. She let silence settle, and the room obeyed. Her gaze traveled row by row, piercing every student who dared meet her eyes. Most looked away. A few straightened their posture instinctively. Then her stare caught something in the back of the room. Her expression didn't change, but her body tensed almost imperceptibly. She had seen him. Keanu didn't flinch. He returned her gaze, not confrontational, not passive, just still, like a man who had already heard every insult that could be thrown and had long stopped reacting to them. Professor Mercer turned to the board. In one fluid motion, she picked up the chalk and underlined her name with slow, deliberate force. "I am Professor Mercer," she said, voice clear and cold. "This is advanced multivariable calculus. If you are here expecting comfort, applause, or indulgence, I suggest you leave now." No one moved. "I do not care about your GPAs, your extracurriculars, your athletic scholarships, or your follower counts. In this room, intellect is the only currency. The weak will be exposed. The arrogant will be corrected." She paused, her eyes drifting again to the back of the room. "And if you came here expecting your fame to do the work for you," she let the words hang like fog over a cliff, "you're already behind." Gasps rippled through the rows. Some students looked at Keanu, then quickly looked away. But he didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply turned to a clean page and began taking notes. The game had started. Professor Mercer turned back to the board and began writing. Her hand moved with sharp precision, laying out vector fields and partial derivatives with the care of a surgeon. She didn't teach, she declared. Each definition dropped like a gavel, each example sharpened to intimidate. Students scribbled furiously, terrified of missing something, terrified of being asked to explain anything. She gave no room for questions, no time for hesitation. She worked through one problem, then another, faster than anyone could follow. No guiding context, no encouragement, just brutal momentum. And still, in the back, Keanu's pen moved steadily. No pause, no strain. He didn't copy her notes word for word. He interpreted them, reshaping her steps into elegant expressions on the page. Where others saw chaos, he found flow. After 40 relentless minutes, she turned sharply and asked, "Who here can explain the physical meaning of a divergence in a vector field?" No one spoke. She scanned the room slowly. A few students squirmed. One boy looked halfway ready to raise his hand, then changed his mind. Another girl pretended to be deep in her notes. Silence thickened. Then Mercer looked back again. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Reeves," she said coolly, "would you care to enlighten us?" The room turned toward him in a single wave. Keanu didn't even glance up. He finished writing a line, closed his notebook softly, and looked at her with calm patience. "I think the question has more impact if the class is first allowed to reflect," he said gently. "Sometimes it takes a moment for real understanding to surface." Several students blinked. One smiled involuntarily. Mercer's mouth twitched, but whether it was irritation or intrigue, no one could tell. She turned back to the board without responding. "Very well," she said flatly. "We'll move on." But her pacing was off now, just slightly. Her delivery less sharp, her voice more clipped. Something in the room had changed, and she felt it. Keanu opened his notebook again and resumed taking notes as if nothing had happened. When the class finally ended, the tension in the air was almost visible. Students hurried to gather their things. A few whispered quietly as they moved past him. No one dared to speak to him directly, but everyone looked. He didn't stand right away. He sat for a moment longer, finishing a final line in his notebook. Only when the room was nearly empty did he rise, sling the notebook under one arm, and walk out the back door without a sound. Mercer watched him go, her expression unreadable, but her eyes stayed on that door long after it closed. 2 days later, the students returned to Lecture Hall B17 with quiet dread. The first session had left them reeling. Some were already considering dropping the course. Others clung to the hope that things might soften, that the professor's edge might dull. But deep down, they knew better. Professor Mercer was already there when they arrived. Chalk in hand, board wiped clean, hair tied back in a tighter knot than before. No words of greeting, no small talk, just numbers. She dove straight into the material with surgical precision. The lesson opened with partial differential equations but quickly spiraled into vector calculus, divergence theorems, and multi-dimensional integrals. She filled the blackboard line after line, symbols growing more complex by the minute. This wasn't teaching, it was war. "Many of you think calculus is about memorization," she said, not turning to the class. "It is not. It is the language of reality. The difference between understanding and imitation is the difference between vision and blindness." Chalk clicked against the board as she underlined a dense expression. "And we are surrounded by illusion," she continued. "Illusion of intelligence, illusion of ability, illusion of expertise. But mathematics reveals truth. It does not bend to fame or fiction." The room was still. Mercer finally turned. Her eyes swept across the students, then they stopped at the very back. Keanu Reeves was in his seat again. Same spot, same notebook, same expression of quiet attention. The tension sharpened. "Let's test something," Mercer said. She tapped the board with her chalk, pointing to a section of a complex transformation function, its derivatives splayed across 2 panels. "This gradient maps scalar fields to directional movement. Anyone care to walk us through this?" No one answered. She scanned the room. A few students looked down. One boy fidgeted with his pen. A girl stared at the floor, lips pressed tight. "Mr. Reeves," she said finally, voice crisp. Gasps moved through the room like a wave. All eyes turned to the back row. Keanu looked up slowly, his pen still resting on his page. His eyes met Mercer's. Calm, grounded. "If it helps the class," he said, "then I'd be happy to try." A beat of silence followed. One girl near the front turned to her friend and whispered, "Is he serious?" Another student elbowed a guy in the next row. "This is going to be bad." But Keanu stood without urgency. He closed his notebook, slid it beneath his arm, and walked down the steps toward the front of the class. Not fast, not slow, no drama, just movement with purpose. Mercer stepped aside, arms crossed. "Go on, then." Keanu reached the front of the room and paused, his eyes scanning the equation that stretched across the board. It was a tangle of partial derivatives, vector symbols, and unfamiliar notations Mercer had clearly added to intimidate. But he didn't react. Instead, he picked up a piece of chalk, turned slightly to the students, and asked softly, "Has anyone here ever walked along a hill and felt gravity pull you sideways, not just down?" There was silence. Then a few heads nodded, uncertain. "That's what this equation is about," he said, pointing to the gradient. "Not just how steep something is, but which direction it's pulling you at every point. The gradient doesn't just describe the surface, it describes how the surface behaves." He walked to the leftmost edge of the board and began drawing. First a simple curved hill. Then he added arrows, vectors, showing the direction of steepest ascent at various points. "See these arrows? These are gradients. This function we're looking at describes a scalar field, maybe temperature, maybe pressure, maybe height. The gradient tells us how fast and in what direction that quantity increases." He paused, letting the image sink in. Then he moved back to the equation. "This part," he said, pointing to a second term, is just a Jacobean in disguise. She wrote it to look more complicated, but it's just measuring how a tiny change in position affects a change in the field. Think of it like pressing a finger into fabric and seeing how it pulls in different directions. A murmur moved through the room. He continued, step by step, breaking down the transformation into its components. Where Mercer had written an intimidating mess of notation, Keanu showed connections, patterns. He didn't erase her work, he illuminated it. Several students leaned forward, watching him work. He added a second drawing, this time showing a three-dimensional surface with force vectors. When you walk uphill, your body intuitively follows this vector. Your muscles respond to it, even if you can't name the math behind it. That's the gradient field. He circled a dense portion of the equation and turned slightly toward Mercer. This section is valid but redundant. If you reduce it through substitution, he showed the algebra step by step. It simplifies to this, he pointed to a line he'd just written, which is much easier to work with and reveals the symmetry more clearly. Mercer didn't speak, but her jaw was set. Keanu turned back to the students. Math shouldn't be about fear. It's a language. You can either speak it fluently or you memorize a few phrases and hope no one asks for directions. He placed the chalk down gently. Then he stepped back. The room stayed completely still. No one was breathing loudly. No one shuffled notebooks. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade behind the silence that filled Lecture Hall B17. For a moment, the chalkboard looked like something else entirely. Less a battlefield and more a mural. Mercer's lines had been transformed, not challenged, but translated into something students could finally see. Then it happened. A single hand rose in the front row. A student who hadn't spoken once in the first class. Her voice was hesitant. So the gradient isn't just a number, it's like a compass? Keanu looked at her with quiet warmth. Exactly, he said. It tells you which way to go when you're trying to reach the highest point, or avoid the lowest. In nature, that direction matters more than the value itself. Another student leaned over to his classmate and whispered, "That makes more sense than anything I've read in 3 weeks." Professor Mercer's face remained unreadable, but her hands were clasped tighter than before. She took 2 steps toward the board, heels echoing on the floor. Her eyes skimmed the chalk lines he had added, his diagrams, his reduction, his substitution, then looked at the students. "Interesting," she said, voice controlled. "Very illustrative." She didn't thank him. She didn't offer praise. She simply picked up the eraser and, without warning, began wiping the board clean. The chalk squeaked slightly as it vanished, line by line, until nothing remained of what either of them had written. Keanu returned to his seat without comment. He walked the same way he came, unhurried, humble, with the quiet bearing of someone who never needed to prove anything in the first place. He opened his notebook, flipped back to the same page, and continued jotting down notes as if he had never left his seat. Mercer turned to face the class again. Her eyes flicked once more to the back row before she spoke. "We'll continue with gradient descent next session. Class dismissed." Students began packing up quickly, their faces caught between confusion and awe. Some glanced back toward Keanu as they filed out. Others whispered to each other with widened eyes. But Keanu didn't move. He was still writing. And Mercer? She watched him for just a second longer than she needed to. Then she turned, gathered her things, and left the room without a word. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The garage was quiet except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock and the gentle scratch of chalk against a blackboard. Dim afternoon light filtered through a dusty window, falling on scattered books and open notebooks. The air smelled faintly of old paper, cedar, and motor oil. Keanu stood barefoot on the concrete floor, chalk in hand, drawing delicate loops and dense equations on a board bolted to the wall. The blackboard was worn, with faded edges and ghostly outlines of past work still visible beneath the fresh writing. He had outgrown the space years ago, but he never replaced it. There was something sacred about this room, this silence. To his left, a work table was buried under texts and journals. Euler's Introductio, Gödel's Incompleteness, Shannon's Mathematical Theory of Communication, and a thin, underlined copy of Emmy Noether's collected papers. Dozens of others were stacked in no particular order, their spines broken, pages marked, margins filled with notes. Some had been read so many times that entire passages lived in his head. On the blackboard, he rewrote the gradient divergence identity, then paused to stare at the result. It wasn't just about solving. It was about seeing structure where others saw confusion. He erased the bottom half, rewrote it in polar coordinates, then stepped back. No audience, no fanfare. This was how he spent most evenings when he wasn't filming, writing, or flying across the world. Here, in a garage barely big enough for a small car, Keanu unraveled math problems for one reason only: peace. A photograph hung on a pinboard nearby. Two boys in their 20s stood side by side, grinning awkwardly into the camera. One was Keanu. The other wore thick glasses and a MIT hoodie, his arm slung casually around Keanu's shoulder. Darren Kim. Brilliant. Quiet. Funny in a way most people never understood. Darren had dreams of working in artificial intelligence, of building algorithms to solve real-world problems, especially in climate science. But life hadn't made room for him. He'd struggled with mental illness, dropped out during his second year, and never quite found his way back. Keanu had tried to keep in touch, but eventually Darren's silence became permanent. That photo was 10 years old. Keanu stared at it now, the chalk in his hand lowering slowly. "I couldn't help him then," he murmured, voice low and tired. "But maybe now." He looked back at the board, at the math, at the patterns Darren had once seen with startling clarity. Maybe he couldn't rewrite the past, but maybe he could honor it. Later that evening, Keanu sat at the small wooden desk in the corner of the garage. A single lamp lit the space, casting a warm glow over the pages of a thick calculus textbook. The margins of the book were already marked, notes layered upon older notes with questions, corrections, and elegant rewrites penned in black ink. He flipped to the chapter on vector-valued functions and gradients, tracing the section Mercer had rushed through earlier that day. Where her board had been crowded with mechanical complexity, Keanu searched for the elegance beneath. He turned to a blank page in his notebook and slowly began to rewrite one of the examples, but in reverse. Starting from the outcome and working backward, he asked himself what would make the result inevitable, not just correct. For him, math had never been about brute force. It was a conversation, a feeling, a hum beneath the noise. He highlighted a sentence in the textbook that read, "Gradient fields indicate direction and rate of steepest ascent." Beside it, he wrote in the margin, "And sometimes, it's the direction we resist most that leads us where we need to go." He paused again. This wasn't just preparation for a class, this was something deeper. In another notebook, smaller, older, he kept a running list of moments he wished he could relive with Darren. Times he could have said more, times he could have asked different questions. Moments where he had failed to recognize how close Darren was to slipping away. On one page, a sentence stood alone. If someone had just made math feel less like judgment, maybe he would have stayed. Keanu tapped the pen gently against the paper. That's what Mercer didn't understand. Her knowledge was brilliant, even precise, but it sat behind a wall of fear. A wall too many never had the strength to climb. He wasn't in that classroom to show off. He wasn't there to confront her ego. He was there to offer something Darren never got: a bridge, a way in, a safe place for students who knew they were capable, but had never been told so. He closed the textbook and pulled out a fresh sheet of graph paper. One by one, he sketched a visual path for the next lecture's concept. A mountain slope, a changing vector field. He turned each equation into a diagram, each diagram into a metaphor. His goal wasn't to impress. His goal was to make someone in that room, just one person, believe they weren't stupid. Because someone once failed to do that for his best friend. And he hadn't forgotten. The next morning, Keanu woke early. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, sat by the open window in his kitchen, and listened to the faint sound of the wind stirring through the trees. The same wind he used to hear when he and Darren would sit outside campus dorms, scribbling equations on napkins and cardboard boxes, debating the logic behind Gödel's incompleteness theorem, like it was a late-night campfire story. He thought about those nights a lot now. He thought about how no one had ever made Darren feel like he belonged in those classrooms. How being brilliant wasn't enough if no one opened the door from the inside. That's what drove him now. Not vengeance, not ego, but quiet redemption. Keanu stood and carried his coffee back into the garage. He opened the textbook Mercer had assigned and started reviewing the next chapter: Jacobian matrices, curl, and divergence. This time, he didn't just highlight key formulas. He wrote questions in the margins he hoped Mercer would ask. He wrote answers too, but not just in mathematical form. He translated them into images, into meaning. Then, in the far right margin, he added a single line in his careful handwriting. Teach it, so they feel safe to get it wrong. As the sun lifted higher, he packed his materials into a single, leather-bound folder and placed it beside his worn notebook. No briefcase, no fanfare. Just the tools he needed to be ready. He wasn't preparing to debate Mercer. He wasn't walking into her class to win anything. He was preparing to stand in that room, again in the back row, with the quiet hope that something he said, some metaphor, some image, would land in the right mind, at the right time. Maybe it would be the kid with shaking hands who hadn't spoken since the first day. Maybe it would be the girl who stopped asking questions after being corrected too harshly. Maybe it would be someone like Darren, still fighting to believe that intelligence didn't have to come with shame. And maybe Mercer would hear it too. Maybe not now, maybe not yet, but eventually, because there was a difference between knowing how to teach math and knowing how to make someone believe they could understand it. Keanu buttoned his jacket, picked up his folder, and looked once more at the chalkboard in the garage. Equations half erased, diagrams still glowing faintly in the light. He didn't wipe them clean. He left them there, just in case someone else ever needed to see them. Then he turned out the light, stepped into the crisp air, and walked towards something unfinished. 3 days had passed since Keanu had stood calmly at the board and turned a harsh lecture into a moment of clarity. But in that short time, something had shifted. Something subtle, but undeniable. The energy in Lecture Hall B17 felt different now. Students arrived a little earlier, sat a little straighter, and watched at the front of the room with an expectation they didn't fully understand. Mercer noticed it. She didn't need words to sense when authority was beginning to slip. The murmurs after class, the way students leaned toward the back row when Keanu spoke, the nods when he clarified something she'd rushed past. He never raised his voice, never made a show of his knowledge, but somehow that made it worse. She stood by the board that morning before anyone else arrived, chalk in hand, her jaw tight. The board was blank, but her mind raced with intention. If he wanted to play the part of the quiet genius, then let him prove it. She would build something he couldn't just diagram away. She began writing. It started with a nested limit equation. Then she layered on matrix functions, switched coordinate systems mid-disqualification, and disguised the structure of the function by embedding a removable discontinuity. By the time students started arriving, she had filled half the board. By the time the clock struck the hour, the board was covered. A dense jungle of symbols. A maze of logic wrapped in abstraction. No clear instructions, no friendly framing. Just math that looked like it belonged in a graduate thesis. Mercer stepped back, wiped the chalk dust from her fingers, and turned to face the class. There was no greeting, no warm-up, just a cold smile. "This is not from your textbook," she said, voice flat. "It is not from your syllabus. It will not appear on your exams. It exists only to separate those who understand from those who pretend." Students stared at the wall of math in stunned silence. She let the moment stretch. Anyone feel brave enough to try? No one moved. A few glanced nervously at one another. One student coughed quietly. Another looked down at her open notebook, as if afraid to be seen. Mercer's arms folded. "Disappointing," she said. And then from the back of the room, a voice rose. Calm, steady, polite. "May I try?" All heads turned. Keanu stood, notebook tucked beneath his arm. He made no show of it. No sigh, no deep breath. Just movement, a quiet decision. He stepped down toward the front of the class with the same energy he always carried. Steady, unshaken. "You impressed." Mercer watched him approach with her arms still crossed, a single eyebrow lifting as if to say, "Finally." Keanu reached the board and paused, not to perform, but to understand. He didn't lift the chalk right away. He stood still, scanning the full length of the equation with quiet concentration. To anyone watching, it was like watching a chess master study the entire board before making the first move. The symbol sprawled from left to right, switching coordinate spaces without warning, coupling limits with summation indices that appeared to conflict. For a less experienced eye, it was chaos. But Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Instead, he took a step closer, studying the heart of the equation. The room was silent. Students leaned forward without realizing it. Then he turned slightly toward Mercer. "You layered two systems," he said quietly. "One nested inside the other." Mercer said nothing. Keanu picked up the chalk. He didn't erase anything. Instead, he walked to the far left of the board and began adding annotations. Small, tight notes beside the original symbols. He boxed the first few terms and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "This limit expression," he said, pointing, "is disguised as divergent, but it's not. The contradiction depends on treating this sequence." He circled a term near the middle of the expression, as if it fails to converge in R, but it does. It just takes longer than expected under this substitution. The room shifted. Students sat up straighter. One boy whispered, "Wait, he found the trick." Another girl said, "She did build a trap." Keanu continued writing, not rushing but not hesitating either. Each move was clear, deliberate. He decomposed the function, realigned the coordinate shift to isolate the discontinuity, and then wrote the inelegant reduction beneath it. "You hit a contradiction between discrete and continuous interpretation," he said without accusation. "It's clever, but it doesn't hold once the sequence is reclassified properly." Mercer's face froze. Her arms lowered slightly. Keanu finished the final line, boxed the simplified result, and underlined it. Then, for the first time, he turned back to the students, not with pride, but with an open tone of explanation. "The mistake," he said gently, "was assuming this system breaks under pressure. But it doesn't. It just requires the right perspective." And then he put the chalk down. The room held its breath. A moment passed. Then someone began clapping. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a few hesitant hands. But it spread, slowly, awkwardly, then firmly. Soft applause filled the lecture hall, not because of who he was, but because of what he'd just done. Keanu didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, then turned toward Mercer. She didn't speak, but her jaw clenched. Her grip tightened around her folder, and without a word, she turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt louder than any slam. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Keanu remained at the front, still facing the board, His hands rested at his sides, chalk dust lightly clinging to his fingertips. He didn't seem triumphant. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he looked quietly reflective, as if the entire exercise hadn't been about proving anything, but about showing something that needed to be seen. After another moment, he turned back toward the class. "I know that felt like a performance," he said gently. "It wasn't meant to." He picked up the eraser and slowly began to clean the board, not erasing her work to remove it, but clearing space, making room for what came next. He didn't fill the new space with more complexity. He drew a small graph, an axis, a curve, and began sketching the shape of a converging function. As he drew, he spoke softly, like a teacher guiding someone across a narrow bridge. This is what that problem was hiding, a simple idea underneath a difficult shell. It's easy to miss when fear gets in the way. A student near the front, someone who hadn't spoken all semester, raised their hand slowly. "Why did she do that?" they asked. "Make it unsolvable on purpose?" Keanu paused. "Sometimes people build traps," he said, "not because they want you to fail, but because they think pain is the only way to teach." The room stayed quiet. Then another hand went up. "I didn't understand any of that equation at first," the student said. "But when you explained the mistake, it actually made sense, like something clicked." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's all that matters." He turned to erase the last part of the board. The function, the simplification, the entire trap now diffused. As he walked back to his seat in the back row, the students tracked him with their eyes, no longer as a celebrity, no longer just an anomaly. Something had changed. They saw him now as someone who could lead quietly, without ever raising his voice, someone who didn't need a title to be a teacher. And from that moment on, the class wouldn't be the same. Mercer hadn't returned, but something in the room had remained, a sense of possibility, a spark. And all it had taken was someone who saw past the illusion of brilliance into the heart of understanding. Keanu Reeves picked up his notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and waited for the next chapter to begin. By the end of the day, the story had already traveled far beyond the four walls of Lecture Hall B17. Students whispered about it in the library, retold it in dorm rooms, passed it between study groups with a mix of awe and disbelief. "He stood up and solved the whole thing," one student said. "She didn't say a word, just left." Another added, "It wasn't just that he solved it. He explained it, like, we actually got it." By the next morning, the campus felt changed. What had once been just another brutal course on the schedule was now the talk of the university. Students from engineering, physics, even economics heard what happened. A few grad students snuck into the back of the lecture hall just to see if the rumors were true. A camera club member lingered near the side entrance, pretending to adjust his lens but secretly recording what might unfold. Keanu entered last, as always. His steps were quiet, his posture calm. Same notebook, same black clothes, same seat in the back. He offered a slight nod to a student who smiled at him nervously. He didn't seek attention, but the attention followed him now. The room was packed by the time the clock struck the hour. Not just full, overflowing. Some students sat on the steps. Others stood along the back wall. Even a few professors slipped in, trying to act casual. Then the front door opened. Professor Mercer walked in slowly, her heels echoing with sharp control. She carried no notes. Her blazer was buttoned to the top, and her expression was unreadable. She reached the front of the room, turned to face the sea of eyes, and let her gaze settle. A pause. Then she spoke. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice steady, "would you like to teach the class today?" The room stopped breathing. A few students turned toward Keanu in unison, mouths slightly open. He didn't answer right away. He stood carefully, then stepped down the row with a quiet grace. When he reached the aisle, he walked slowly toward the front, never rushing, never performing. At the board, he looked not at Mercer but at the students. "Only if I'm allowed to share," he said softly, "not dominate." A few students blinked. One girl mouthed the word, "Wow." Mercer studied him for a long moment. No nod, no smirk, no surrender. But after a breath, she stepped to the side. "Then share," she said. Keanu looked down at the clean board, picked up the chalk, and began. Keanu drew a wide set of axes near the top of the board and labeled them with clear, familiar symbols. His handwriting was clean and patient, as if every stroke had meaning. Then he turned back to the room. "Today," he said, "we're going to talk about Jacobian matrices. But don't worry, we won't start with the formula. We'll start with something real." He turned back to the board and drew the outline of a city street grid. A few curves suggested roads, intersections, slopes. Arrows flowed from one point to another, resembling traffic patterns. "Imagine you're tracking traffic through a downtown grid," he said. "Some roads are straight, some are curved. Elevation changes, speeds vary, and you want to predict how a small change in direction here," he pointed to one spot, "affects movement 2 blocks away." He drew a matrix beside the map. That's what Jacobians do. They map how changes in one space affect another. They don't just measure movement, they measure influence. He paused, letting the image breathe. A student in the second row leaned forward. Someone near the back began taking photos of the board. "It's not just traffic," Keanu continued. "It's how heat moves through a metal plate, how pressure shifts in a fluid system. It's even how neural networks adjust during back propagation and machine learning. Jacobians aren't just math, they're maps. They guide us through spaces we can't see." He stepped aside and pointed to the original equation again. "The traditional form is intimidating, derivatives stacked over each other. But when you realize each entry just tells you how fast something changes with respect to something else, it becomes intuitive." He rewrote the formula slowly, labeling each partial derivative with an explanation. The students followed every movement of his hand. "The Jacobian doesn't demand you memorize, it asks you to see." Someone in the audience whispered, "I've never heard it explained like that." Another student, an electrical engineering major, raised her hand. "So, in power grids, when voltage changes at one station, the Jacobi can tell us how it affects the others?" Keanu smiled. "Exactly. You're already thinking like an applied mathematician." A wave of heads nodded across the room. Eyes were lit up now, not from struggle, but from clarity. Students who had never raised their hands before began jotting down notes with purpose. A few even leaned toward one another to exchange ideas. The tension that had defined Mercer's classroom was dissolving, replaced by something Mercer hadn't seen in years: curiosity. Keanu paused one final time and wrote 5 words across the top of the board: "Maps for multi-layered spaces." Then he stepped away, chalk in hand, and turned to Mercer. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. Professor Mercer stood beside him in absolute stillness. Her arms were crossed, but not defensively, more like someone holding something in, some thought or emotion she hadn't decided whether to show. She looked at the board, at the sketches, at the simplicity now woven into what had once been dense complexity. Then her eyes swept the room. Students leaned forward. Some had even abandoned their laptops, writing by hand. One boy had started sketching his own city map, trying to apply the Jacobian idea himself. Another was whispering to a friend, connecting the lesson to a robotics project. This wasn't admiration. This was engagement. Mercer's jaw flexed slightly. Keanu returned the chalk to the tray and stepped to the side. He wasn't lingering in front of the class. He wasn't soaking in the attention. He just waited for her to resume, quiet, composed, ready to retreat back to the seat he always took. Mercer inhaled deeply. "Let's open the floor," she said finally. "Any questions for Mr. Reeves?" The room was silent at first. Then a hand rose. "How did you make it seem so simple?" a voice asked. Keanu looked at the student and answered with no ego in his voice. I spent years trying to solve problems the hard way. Eventually, I realized the only way through was to stop looking at the numbers and start seeing the meaning behind them. Another hand. Do you teach full-time? A soft smile. No, I'm just here to learn. Mercer's eyes flicked toward him at that. The subtle irony was hard to miss. A man who had just taught the most lucid lecture her class had seen in years, claiming to be the student. She cleared her throat. That's enough for today, she said. We'll continue with tensor applications next time. Students didn't move immediately. They lingered. They were waiting for something more, but Mercer didn't give it. She turned and began gathering her things. Keanu nodded to a student who waved, then returned quietly to the back of the room. No celebration, no spotlight, just presence. As the students filed out, one leaned toward another. I actually want to come to the next class, she whispered. Can you believe that? In the front of the room, Mercer stood still for a moment longer. She glanced at the phrase Keanu had written, maps for multi-layered spaces. Then, slowly, she turned back toward her bag, her expression tight. She didn't erase it. Not this time. But she didn't look back either, because deep down she knew what had happened. Her class had changed, not because she had let it, but because someone had reminded them why they wanted to understand in the first place. The chatter in the faculty lounge was unusually lively for a Tuesday morning. Professors from several departments had gathered around the tall coffee machine, pouring black espresso into paper cups, talking in lowered voices with raised eyebrows. Hell solved it right in front of her, someone said near the pastry tray. I heard he broke down the Jacobite in under 10 minutes, had them all listening like it was a TED Talk, said another. And Mercer just stood there? A philosophy lecturer raised an eyebrow. She let him teach? A younger adjunct from the physics department leaned in. He's not even on the teaching roster. Is he auditing the course? That was when Professor Lilith Mercer walked into the lounge. The room quieted, ever so slightly. No one addressed her directly, but the glances were unavoidable. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, turned and met the question head-on without being asked. He's a guest, she said. Her voice was even, but her hand, gripping the coffee cup, trembled faintly. She left the lounge without sitting. Back in her office, she shut the door and lowered the blinds. She stood at her desk, staring at the folders she had meant to review for the departmental curriculum proposal. But her eyes drifted to the small external hard drive connected to her laptop. A student had emailed her a file the night before. Attached was a video. The lecture. She clicked play. The screen filled with the image of her classroom. Keanu at the board, calm, precise, his voice low but clear. She watched him explain Jacobians with traffic maps, thermodynamics, neural nets, tools she had never thought to use. His tone was never arrogant. He never looked to her for validation. He looked only at the board and the students. Mercer fast-forwarded to the moment he simplified her earlier equation from the week before. The trap she had designed. He had seen it, seen through it, corrected it, yes, but more than that, he had made it gentle, understandable. She paused the video. Then she picked up her chalk and walked to the small board behind her desk. It had been years since she had worked problems by hand. Line by line, she rewrote the equation Keanu had solved. She tried to follow it the way he had, identifying the misclassified sequence. Twice. She stopped and shook her head. But by the third time through, something shifted. She saw it, the contradiction she had built, and the path he had used to remove it. Her jaw clenched. It wasn't just that he had solved it. It was that he had understood the intent behind the failure, then guided others around it without humiliating anyone. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. And it was the part that made her wonder, was she feeling threatened, or was she starting to feel inspired? Mercer closed the video player and let her hands fall into her lap. The office was silent except for the soft hum of the heater kicking on near the floor. A faint draft brushed against her cheek, but she didn't move. Her eyes were still fixed on the blackboard behind her desk, where the final line of Keanu's rewritten solution glowed faintly in chalk. She could see it now, not just the math, but the way he taught it. His words hadn't been carefully rehearsed. They hadn't carried the edge she had relied on for so many years. There was no intimidation in his voice, no pressure, only clarity, as if knowledge was something to be offered, not wielded. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself, but some part of her had built those problems with the goal of dominance, to expose the gap between her and everyone else, to reaffirm that she still belonged at the top. And yet, Keanu hadn't fought her. He hadn't even resisted. He had simply answered the problem the way she should have asked it. Mercer stood and erased the board behind her slowly. The movement was deliberate, not because she didn't want to remember, but because she needed to make room. She stared at the clean slate for a long time before sitting back down, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper, and drafting a new problem set. This time, the problems weren't meant to intimidate. They were meant to reveal. Meanwhile, outside the faculty building, Keanu walked quietly beside a student across the main quad. The boy was tall, skinny, with a mop of curly hair and a textbook clutched tightly under his arm. He looked nervous, like someone who didn't quite know how to breathe in the presence of a man the world already seemed to worship. Keanu didn't ask his name. He didn't ask why the boy had stayed after class. He simply walked beside him until they found a bench near the library steps. The student opened his book, flipped to a page filled with partial differential equations, and pointed to a spot near the bottom. "I don't get this," he admitted. At all. It looks fine when I read it, but when I try to solve it, nothing makes sense." Keanu leaned over and scanned the problem, then looked at the boy. "What feels wrong about it?" The student blinked. I don't know. Everything?" "Okay," Keanu said calmly. "Then let's find out together." He didn't correct him. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. He got it. And slowly the boy began to answer his own doubts, not with perfect solutions, but with better questions. It was subtle, but it was transformation, and Keanu treated it like the most important work he'd done all week. As the two of them sat under the faint glow of the library's second-floor windows, the student's pencil moved more confidently. He didn't look certain, but he wasn't frozen anymore. Every time he hesitated, Keanu didn't jump in with a fix. He asked another question. "Why do you think that limit exists? What happens if you graph the function? What's the shape telling you?" The boy blinked at the word shape, like it didn't belong in math class. But then he nodded slowly. "Oh," he said, "because it curves toward a value even though it never touches it." "Exactly," Keanu said. "So what does that mean for your limit?" "That it exists, even if the function itself never reaches it." Keanu smiled. "That's the trick. Math doesn't always care about arrival. It's about direction." The boy let out a short laugh. "I think that's the first time I've understood something without feeling like I was being watched." Keanu said nothing at first. Then he turned toward him, voice softer than before. "You're never being watched. Not really. Everyone's too busy worrying they're the ones being judged." The student didn't speak after that. He just looked down at his notebook, flipping back a few pages. His posture changed, shoulders uncoiling, breath easing. Nearby, other students began to trickle past on their way to the dorms or the study rooms. A few glanced over, recognizing Keanu, but no one interrupted. Something about the moment felt off-limits, sacred. Inside her office, Mercer sat staring at her computer again. She had pulled up the departmental spreadsheet, course evaluations, pass rates, faculty feedback. Her class consistently had the lowest engagement scores and the highest drop rate. For years, she had justified it. "It's a hard course," she told herself. It's supposed to weed out the ones who don't belong. But for the first time, she questioned the premise. What if they had belonged all along? What if the weeding out wasn't about math? What if it had been about fear? She glanced down at her own notes, pages where she'd reworked the very problem Keanu had unraveled in front of the class. His annotations still floated in her mind, the way he spoke to the idea instead of over it, the way students leaned in instead of shutting down. She exhaled slowly and reached for her pen. The next assignment she wrote started with a question, not an instruction. It read, "What do you think this function is trying to tell you?" She didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like a beginning. And maybe, for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to learn something new. Professor Mercer arrived early. The lecture hall B17 was still empty when she entered, the lights buzzing faintly above her. She walked straight to the board and pulled 3 fresh sticks of chalk from her case. She wasn't interested in repeating what had already happened. This time, she had something different planned. She stood in front of the board and began constructing a new equation. It wasn't a direct confrontation like before. It was something more intricate, a 3-variable optimization problem that included nested constraints, subtle notation switches, and dependency traps hidden within the structure. On the surface, it looked solvable. But unless you caught the subtle flaw in the interaction between the third variable and a shifting inequality constraint, it would fall apart. She didn't build it to humiliate this time, but she did build it to test something. By the time the room filled, the board was dense with symbols. The students, now used to complexity, were alert but cautious. There was an unspoken tension in the room. No one knew what direction today's lesson might take. Some eyed the equation with dread. Others glanced to the back row, where Keanu sat quietly, notebook open, waiting. Mercer turned from the board and faced them. "This problem," she said, "is not about speed. It's about clarity. 3 variables, multiple constraints. Real-world problems don't give you clean solutions. They give you incomplete information and hidden interactions. This is a simulation of that." She paused, then locked eyes with the back row. "Mr. Reeves?" All heads turned. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He looked at the board for a long moment, then slowly closed his notebook. He stood, walked down the aisle like he had before, but something in his energy had shifted. More thoughtful, more measured. He stood at the front and studied the equation again. Then he turned to Mercer. "May I invite a fellow student to work through it with me?" he asked calmly. The room erupted in quiet whispers. Mercer blinked. The request caught her completely off guard. "You need assistance?" she asked, not mockingly but genuinely, surprised. Keanu shook his head. "No, but sometimes a second perspective reveals what one person might miss, and I think this class deserves to see what that looks like." Mercer's face remained neutral, but her posture stiffened. "Very well," she said. "Choose who you'd like." Keanu looked around the room, not at the eager students in the front, not at the ones who had already proven themselves. His eyes landed on a girl in the 3rd row, half hidden behind her open notebook. A girl who had never raised her hand. A girl who flinched when Mercer called on others. "You saw the pattern in the Jacobian last week," Keanu said gently. "Would you join me?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to her. The girl's name was Elise. Few people knew that because she hadn't spoken much in class since the semester began. Her voice was rarely heard, and when it was barely above a whisper. She often stayed behind after lectures, not to ask questions, but to silently recopy her notes, correcting her own mistakes in pencil. Now every eye in the room was on her. She looked stunned at first, then confused. She pointed at herself as if unsure she'd heard him right. Keanu nodded once, inviting, not pressuring. "You saw it," he repeated. "Let's walk through this together." For a moment, she didn't move. Mercer arched a brow, her arms folding. But then, with small steps and trembling hands, Elise stood. Her notebook still in her hands, she made her way to the front. As she walked, a few students leaned aside to give her space. Whispers were exchanged behind cupped hands. When she reached Keanu, he leaned down and quietly said something only she could hear. She gave a tiny nod, then faced the board. Keanu handed her the chalk. She looked at it like it might break in her fingers. Then he gestured to the first section of the problem and said, "Where would you start?" Elise stared at the equation. At first, nothing happened. Then she pointed to the rightmost term. "This constraint here," she said slowly, "it's not independent. It loops back when the variable shifts. That breaks the assumption built into the boundary." A ripple moved through the class. Someone whispered, "She's right." Keanu stepped aside. "She caught something I missed the first time," he said aloud, smiling. Elise looked at him in shock, but he nodded for her to continue. With shaking hands, she began to break the expression into two parts. Keanu helped by drawing a separate diagram to the left of the board. A 3-gax space showing where the constraint folded the variable into a second region of dependency. Together, they walked through the steps. He never interrupted her. When she paused, he asked, "What do you see next?" And each time, she answered with growing confidence. Bit by bit, the trap Mercer had designed began to unravel. Elise pointed out the recursive error baked into the optimization model. Keanu showed how to solve it using a substitution method that converted the dependency into a manageable expression. Mercer didn't move, but her eyes followed every step. Her jaw clenched, not in anger, but in recognition. A student no one had noticed was solving a problem she had believed only Keanu could decode, and she was doing it with his guidance, not his shadow. When Elise reached the final step, she looked back at the equation like it still might fight her. Her hand hesitated just above the chalkboard. Then, slowly, she wrote the last reduction line and circled the solution. Keanu gave her space. He didn't touch the chalk. He didn't correct her work. Instead, he turned to the class. "She did most of it," he said simply. "She saw the dependency loop right away. I missed it." Elise turned, unsure whether to believe him. Her face was flushed, eyes wide with disbelief, but also something else. Light. Something had shifted in her posture. Her shoulders weren't hunched anymore. From the second row, a student clapped once. Then another followed. Within seconds, applause spread across the lecture hall. Not wild or chaotic, just honest and stunned. Not just for the solution. For her. For Elise. Mercer remained standing. She hadn't spoken in minutes. She watched as the girl who had once been invisible now stood confidently at the front of her classroom. She watched as Keanu stepped back, allowing Elise to be the focus of attention. He didn't smile broadly, he didn't bow, he just nodded to her with the same quiet respect he gave everyone. Mercer sat down. It was slow, controlled, but there was no denying it. She had expected Keanu to take over again, to steal the room with his poise and brilliance. But he had done the opposite. He had handed the room to someone else. Someone who had never asked for it, but needed it. As the applause settled, Keanu turned to Elise and whispered something brief. She smiled, nodded, and returned to her seat, now greeted with small smiles and whispered congratulations from classmates who had never even learned her name before. Mercer glanced down at her notes, but they were meaningless now. She couldn't go back to them, not after what she'd just witnessed. She looked up and met Keanu's gaze. He was already walking back to his usual seat in the back row. He didn't look triumphant. He looked content. Mercer turned to the class. Her voice came quieter than usual. "We'll continue this line of problems next time. For now, let's take a moment." Students began packing up, the energy lingering in the air like warmth from a fire that had just gone out. Mercer remained in her chair long after the last student had gone. The board still held Elise's work. she didn't erase it. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the smartest person in the room. And she didn't mind, because someone else had finally learned to speak, and someone else had chosen to listen. Keanu stepped out into the hallway after class, his notebook under his arm, when he saw her waiting. After a while, Professor Mercer stood near the corner office where the light from the stained glass window cast pale colors onto the floor. She was standing perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her, but her eyes were sharp and unreadable. He stopped a few steps away and waited. She didn't speak right away. Finally, she said, "Do you have a moment?" He gave a small nod. She turned and unlocked the door beside her, holding it open just long enough for him to follow. Inside, the office was sparse. Bookshelves neatly arranged, a wall-sized blackboard to the right, a desk with papers stacked precisely at the center. Nothing was out of place, but something felt unsettled in the air. Mercer closed the door behind them and stayed standing. She didn't offer a chair. "Are you trying to humiliate me?" she asked. Her voice wasn't raised, but it was strained, like it had taken her everything to say it aloud. Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked at her, not with surprise, not with defense, but with quiet understanding. "No," he said gently. "I'm trying to help them see what I never could when I was their age." She folded her arms, but her fingers dug into her elbows. "You're not a professor," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Neither are you," he said, "if you can't handle being challenged with kindness." Silence followed. She blinked just once. It wasn't anger that showed on her face next. It was something else, a flicker of pain, the kind that comes from hearing the truth in a place you didn't want to face it. Keanu stepped back slightly, giving her room. "They're not just trying to pass this class," he said. "They're trying to believe they're smart enough to belong in the world you live in, that someone like you will look at them and not laugh." Mercer turned away. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment he thought she might say something sharp. But she didn't. She just stood there, breathing quietly. He didn't press her. Instead, he turned toward the board and gently picked up a piece of chalk that had been left near the tray. He looked at it, not writing anything, then placed it back where it belonged. "I'm not here to replace you," he said softly. "But if all they leave this room with is fear, then none of us have done our job." She didn't reply. He waited another beat, then turned toward the door. "If you ever want to talk, I'm always in the back row." And then he left. She stood in the silence that followed, eyes fixed on the door long after it closed. The next morning, Lecture Hall B17 was quiet. Students entered slower than usual, glancing around as if expecting something to be different. Because it was. The front table was empty. No Mercer. No binder. No notes. No sound of her heels echoing down the aisle with surgical precision. Elise sat in the third row, hugging her notebook tighter than usual. The student Keanu had helped near the library looked around anxiously. Others whispered quietly as the clock ticked past the top of the hour. Still, no one appeared at the podium. Then, from the back of the room, a calm voice spoke. "She may be back tomorrow," Keanu said, standing slowly. "But today, we still learn." Travis, the rustle of backpacks, stopped. Heads turned. He walked down the aisle, not with authority, not with performance, just a quiet purpose, and stepped to the front. He didn't touch the chalk. He didn't write anything. He simply looked out at the students. "There's a misconception that math is cold," he said, "that it only exists in proofs and silence. But that's not what I've found." He paused. "It's a conversation. It speaks if you learn how to listen." No one interrupted. No one looked at their phones. He turned to the board and finally picked up the chalk. Instead of an equation, he drew a simple curve, a changing slope, a small set of axes. Then he added another curve intersecting the first one, and beside it, he wrote a single word: change. "Optimization problems," he said, "aren't just about finding where something peaks or bottoms out. They're about understanding why that point matters and who it matters to. He turned to the class. Today, we're going to learn how to find meaning through constraint. He didn't mean it poetically, but it landed that way. A few students turned to each other, stunned into stillness. Elise opened her notebook. Others followed. And for the next hour, he walked them through multivariable systems, not by formulas alone, but by asking them what felt right, where the edges were, what the function wanted to do, why the system bent at certain places. He didn't dominate the board. He let the board breathe. At one point, a student raised her hand and asked, "Is this still Professor Mercer's class?" Keanu paused. "Yes," he said. "It's hers." Another student asked, "Are you taking over?" He shook his head. "No, just filling space until she decides who she wants to be when she stands here again." There was no judgment in his tone. The employee just hoped. The bell rang, but no one moved right away. It was the rare class where learning felt like release. As students slowly packed up, someone whispered, "That was the first time I didn't feel like a fraud." Another added, "It actually made sense." Keanu returned to the back row, not to own the room, but to make sure there was still room for someone else. And Mercer? She wasn't absent because she'd given up. She was absent because something inside her had broken open, and she didn't yet know how to return without pretending she was the same. The next lecture began like any other. Students shuffled into their seats with a strange mixture of curiosity and tension. Rumors had spread quickly after Keanu's impromptu class the day before. Some said Mercer had resigned. Others claimed she was furious. A few guessed she was simply regrouping. Then the door opened. Professor Mercer walked in slowly, deliberately. Her eyes were red, not from sleep, but from something deeper. Whatever storm had passed through her hadn't vanished. It had simply quieted. She placed her bag on the desk without a word. No greeting, no reprimand. Then she looked at Keanu, who was already seated in the back row, and said in a voice barely louder than the hum of the ceiling fan, "Mr. Reeves, would you join me?" The room stilled. Not even a chair creaked. Students turned their heads slowly toward him. Keanu stood, calmly. No trace of arrogance, only something gentle. He walked down the aisle. At the front of the room, Mercer took a single step back. "Today," she said, "Mr. Reeves and I will co-teach." A wave of whispers broke out across the rows. Some students gasped. A few looked at each other, wide-eyed. Elise blinked twice, as if trying to confirm she heard correctly. And Keanu didn't hesitate. He nodded. Mercer turned to the board and began outlining a system of equations. She drew a three-dimensional curve with two axes shaded in light blue and red. Above it, she labeled the topic: multivariable curvature and dual-space geometry. She didn't explain it yet. She just looked at the class and said, "We're going to bend your brains today, but if we do this right, something might click." Keanu stepped in beside her. He didn't erase what she wrote. Instead, he added beneath it, "Imagine climbing a mountain blindfolded, with only the feel of the slope beneath your feet." The visual met the intuitive. Theoretical structure met metaphor. They began alternating explanations. Mercer gave the rigorous foundation. She referenced Gauss curvature, tensor fields, and differential geometry. Her tone was sharp, confident. The Mercer everyone knew was back, but this time, something had shifted in her posture. Less defensive, more open. Keanu followed with applications. He described how the same ideas appeared in satellite trajectory, in machine learning cost landscapes, even in the way wind patterns curl over ocean surfaces. He didn't explain like a teacher. He guided like a fellow explorer. Together they built a rhythm. Mercer would pose a complex idea. Keanu would simplify it without watering it down. Then Mercer would build it back up with precision. And students followed. Even the boy in the back row, silent all semester, barely taking notes. raised his hand halfway through. "Wait," he said. "So the saddle point, that's like the edge of decision-making, right? Like where things can go either way?" Mercer paused. She was visibly stunned. Then she smiled, not out of triumph, but because someone in the room was alive with understanding. "Yes," she said softly. "Exactly that." The boy nodded, scribbling in his notebook. For the first time, he looked engaged. For the first time, so did everyone else. The lesson continued with an energy that Mercer's classroom had never seen before. No one looked at their phones. No one whispered in the back. Instead, a quiet intensity spread from row to row as students leaned forward, hungry to keep up. Mercer introduced a dual diagram, a set of parallel curves showing how surface behavior could flip depending on your frame of reference. She used a laser pointer to trace the lines on the screen. "This," she said, "is how a local maxima might fool you if you're only looking through one dimension." Keanu chimed in, pacing gently across the front of the room. "It's like being in a maze with mirrors. Every angle tells a different story, but if you learn how to read the distortions, the exit isn't far." There were nods all around. Even Elise, usually cautious with questions, raised her hand. "So, in neural networks, is this why it's so hard to optimize deep models? Because the terrain isn't just steep, it's unpredictable?" Keanu smiled. "Exactly. You're not just climbing a hill. You're navigating 1,000 hills, each with their own shape. And sometimes, the path forward is hidden behind a fold." Mercer looked at Elise. "That's a graduate-level observation." Elise's eyes widened. A ripple of admiration spread toward her. She smiled shyly and scribbled more notes. By the time they reached the end of the session, Mercer's voice had softened. Her usual clipped, clinical tone had given way to something more organic. She was still sharp, still exact, but there was warmth there now. A vulnerability she had always kept locked away. And Keanu? He didn't dominate. He paused often, turning to students and asking them to explain things back. "How would you teach this curve to your younger self?" he asked a boy in the second row. The boy hesitated, then tried. "I'd say, it's like stretching a rubber band over a bowl. You can't see what's underneath, but you can feel it in the way it pushes back." Mercer clapped, just once. Brilliant metaphor. That one clap meant more than a standing ovation. At the end of class, Mercer closed her laptop, looked at Keanu, and nodded. Not as an equal, but as someone who had learned something real. Not about calculus, about humility. The students clapped then, not because anyone asked them to, not because of a dramatic moment, but they clapped because they had just witnessed what real learning looked like. Mercer lingered after everyone left. She stood at the board, staring at a half-erased diagram. Keanu stood beside her, not saying anything. She finally spoke, her voice a whisper. "I didn't think I could change." Keanu looked over. "We all think that. Until we do." She didn't respond, but her smile did. It wasn't a full one, just a flicker. But for Mercer, that was a breakthrough. A crack in the wall, and the first light getting through. The air in the classroom shifted the moment the door opened. No one noticed at first. A few students glanced up but quickly returned their eyes to the whiteboard where Professor Mercer was drawing intersecting parabolas. Keanu stood a few feet back, arms crossed lightly, not as an assistant or student, but something else, something between peer and provocateur. Then someone in the second row stiffened. A girl with auburn curls lowered her phone without even unlocking it. At the back of the room, a tall man in a charcoal suit quietly took a seat. The university crest was barely visible on the lapel pin he wore, but anyone who had seen the faculty webpage would recognize him instantly. It was Dean Elliott. His reputation preceded him, strict, brilliant, and with little tolerance for educational gimmicks. His presence in any lecture hall was rare. When he showed up unannounced, it meant one of two things. Either someone was being quietly evaluated, or a complaint had reached his desk. Professor Mercer's hand faltered slightly as she wrote the next derivative. Only Keanu seemed undisturbed. She turned to the class, steadying herself. Now, as you've seen, these curves form a saddle point, a location where a surface curves up in one direction and down in another. But this is where I'd like to step aside and let Mr. Reeves offer an alternate visualization. The class murmured with anticipation. They had grown used to the unorthodox partnership. Some whispered the university might not allow it for long. Others thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to Harchdale's math department. Keanu took a step forward, holding a small remote. Behind him, the projector lit up with a minimalist 3D animation. A simple grid warped into a saddle shape, like a stretched tarp over two opposing hills. No equations, no jargon, just motion. This, he said gently, is Gaussian curvature. But I want you to stop thinking of it as numbers and symbols. I want you to imagine your feet on this surface. You're standing on the curve. The animation rotated slowly, revealing how the shape moved depending on where you stood. If you walk forward, the surface drops. If you turn sideways, it rises. This isn't just math. This is how valleys form, how bridges bend, how your spine carries weight. The world curves like this when you're not looking. He paused. The class was silent. Even Dean Elliott leaned forward in his chair. Keanu clicked to the next slide, revealing a simple sketch of a banana peel curling on the ground. He smiled. This is also Gaussian curvature, not in theory, in practice. A curved peel has both positive and negative curvature, depending on where you stand. That's why your foot slips, your contact point shifts, and friction vanishes. The peel doesn't change, you do. Laughter rippled softly through the room. He turned to the class. Now, I'd like to ask a question, not a quiz, just a curiosity. What happens to curvature when we apply heat? A student in the back row, normally quiet, raised her hand. It expands? Yes, Keanu said, but not uniformly. Curves shift. Think of a metal beam in the sun. Its edges warp faster than the center. That's curvature in motion. You're witnessing geometry with temperature. Another student raised his hand. Is this like thermal stress? Keanu nodded. Exactly. The stress isn't just physical, it's mathematical. Invisible patterns in structure. Engineers model this with tensors and matrices, but underneath all that, they're still listening to the shape. Professor Mercer stepped closer, watching the animation fade to black. She cleared her throat. May I add something? Keanu gestured toward the board, stepping back with grace. She took the marker and began drawing two intersecting circles on the whiteboard. When we discuss curvature, we often default to single-angle thought, she said. But what Keanu has reminded us is that real systems are multidimensional, interdependent. She paused and looked at the class. This was something I struggled to teach for years. Then she added a third, overlapping circle. The shape now resembled a Venn diagram. Only when we allow different perspectives to intersect, like this, do we really begin to understand, not just memorize. The room was so still that even the HVAC fan felt too loud. Dean Elliott scribbled a note on a small leather-bound pad. Keanu remained near the window, silent, observing, his hands folded. One of the students near the front turned and whispered to another, "Are we watching history?" They weren't far off. At the end of the lecture, Mercer recapped the key points with quiet confidence. Her voice had softened since the semester began. The edge had dulled, but the steel beneath remained. When the last slide disappeared, she turned toward the back of the room. Dean Elliott rose slowly. No one breathed. He walked to the front with measured steps, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "What I witnessed today," he said, "was not just teaching. It was illumination. the kind that awakens not just the mind, but the will to learn. He turned to Mercer. This department has always prided itself on rigor, but what I see now is evolution. Then he turned to Keanu. You are not faculty. You are not even enrolled, but somehow you've become essential. Keanu lowered his eyes, hands still at rest. Dean Elliott smiled slightly. And that, Mr. Reeves, is the mark of a true educator. Dean Elliott turned once more to Mercer. I'd like to recommend formalizing this collaboration. Mr. Reeves clearly has the trust of your students. Mercer glanced at Keanu. For a long moment her lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, she gave a small, respectful nod. Then let us be co-illuminators. The room stirred. Some students smiled. Others simply stared, stunned by how much had changed since the semester began. Keanu walked back to his usual spot near the chalkboard. He didn't raise his arms or bow or gloat. He just smiled gently and tapped the board. Class isn't over, he said. We've only just begun to understand what curvature can teach us. The students leaned in once more, notebooks reopened, pencils ready. Dean Elliott didn't leave immediately. He stood at the back of the room, arms folded, watching not just the board but the space between Keanu and Mercer, the shared rhythm, the mutual respect. And for the first time in a long while, the calculus building at Hartsdale University felt less like a fortress and more like a cathedral of curiosity. Where the ego had ruled, insight now walked freely. And class continued, not louder, but deeper. The classroom was unusually still as Professor Mercer scribbled the words on the whiteboard. Your next assignment: teach this concept to someone who believes they can't learn it. A wave of confusion and quiet curiosity swept across the room. She turned, her voice calm. Not someone from this class, not another student. Find someone out there, anyone, who thinks learning calculus is beyond them, and prove them wrong. No rubric, no equations, just that. Whispers broke out across the room. A few students exchanged uncertain glances. One hand tentatively rose. What do we teach them? Mercer didn't blink. Whatever you just learned. Your choice, but make them understand it. The bell rang, but no one moved at first. The assignment felt strange, unlike anything Mercer had ever given, but not in a bad way. It felt like permission. Permission to connect, rather than just compute. That afternoon, Keanu sat quietly in the campus library. No books, no lecture, just listening. A freshman was sitting across from him, struggling through a problem set. Keanu didn't give answers, just asked questions. Patiently, openly, like light filtering into a dark attic. Nearby, a janitor was sweeping along the marble corridor between the reading tables. He passed them, doubled back and paused, mop in hand. Are you tutoring? The janitor asked. Keanu smiled. Something like that. The janitor shifted awkwardly. I overheard you talking about derivatives. I never got those. Back in school, I failed math every time. Keanu didn't flinch. Do you want to give it another try? The man let out a short laugh. What now? I'm just a janitor. The man hesitated, then shrugged. All right, can't hurt. Keanu stood and gestured toward the tiled floor. Show me how you mop that section right there. The janitor gave him a puzzled look, then started pushing the mop in steady, smooth strokes. Keanu watched his motion, nodding slowly. You see how your motion changes as you reach the edge? Yeah, gotta twist the wrist a little. That shift, that slope change, that's what a derivative captures. The exact moment when the rate of change alters. Like your motion. Same energy, but a shift in flow. The janitor stopped, looking down at his mop. So, wait, you're saying I already know what a derivative feels like? Yes. You've been doing it for years. Silence. Then the janitor burst into a soft chuckle. "I never knew I was smart." Keanu's response came without pause. "Everyone is. They just need the right path." Word of the unusual assignment traveled fast. In the common room, clusters of students talked animatedly. Some were nervous, some were excited. One student, a shy pre-med sophomore named Jenna, approached her elderly neighbor who always watered the courtyard plants outside the dorm. She taught him about limits using flower pots and the time it took for water to soak through different types of soil. Another student, Derek, explained integrals to his little brother using toy blocks, stacking them to represent cumulative areas. He filmed the whole process on his phone, laughing when his brother cheered. "So it's just adding fancy shapes?" And slowly, Hartsdale's quiet corners began lighting up with learning. Meanwhile, Keanu remained in the library for hours. The janitor returned during his break the next day, bringing 2 other co-workers. One had never gone past middle school, another hadn't opened a textbook in decades. But they sat at the long table across from Keanu, who waited with a notepad and a gentle grin. Instead of a lecture, he asked them what confused them most about math growing up. Then he started drawing. Circles, lines, simple curves. He explained gradients through shoe soles on hills, talked about limits using elevator floors and motion sensors. They leaned in. Their eyes sparkled, not because they were learning math, because they were learning they could. That same evening, Professor Mercer sat alone in her office. The campus was quiet, the hallway dim. The assignment had stirred something in her, but not in the way she'd expected. She had hoped students would struggle with it, perhaps come back frustrated, reaffirming how hard it was to truly teach. But instead, they bloomed. She scrolled through videos and posts students had submitted voluntarily. There was no grade attached, yet more than half the class had already turned in something. She watched a girl show her grandfather how parabolas described the arc of a baseball. She saw a boy drawing tangent lines on skate ramps for his cousin. Another group had invited children from a local youth center to do math games in the park. No tests, no pressure, just light, like someone had opened a window. Mercer blinked rapidly, feeling her throat tighten. Her fingers, absent-mindedly, reached toward the bookshelf. They paused at the edge of an old wooden plaque, tucked behind a framed photo of her first research team. It read, "Dr. Evelyn Mercer, Faculty Excellence in Mathematics, 2004. Faculty Excellence in Mathematics, 2004. The greatest good of mankind." She took it down slowly, brushing a bit of dust from its surface. For the first time in years, the words didn't feel like praise. They felt like a question. Later that week, as the late afternoon sun poured through the math building's tall windows, Professor Mercer stood at the back of the classroom and listened. Keanu was not at the board. Instead, students were. One by one, they shared stories of who they taught. They laughed, stumbled, encouraged one another. Keanu sat in the corner, silent, arms folded, simply listening. A few students turned toward him, crediting his help, but he never nodded, never claimed anything. He let their voices take the lead. Mercer had never seen her students this alive before. After class, she lingered behind as the room emptied. Keanu stayed too, packing up slowly. She looked at him. "Way derivatives?" she asked softly. He paused, thinking. "Because they're about change, seeing what's coming, not just where we are." Mercer stared at the chalkboard where someone had written the phrase "change over time" in a jagged box. She whispered, almost to herself, "That's what I forgot." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. She turned to him again, but her voice wasn't sharp or challenging. It was uncertain, vulnerable. "Do you think it's too late to become someone different?" Keanu's eyes were warm. "Not if you're asking the question." Mercer smiled then, a real one, small, earnest. That evening, she walked across the quad, past a group of students showing middle schoolers how to use a math game Keanu had introduced. The kids were laughing. The college students looked like leaders. For the first time in her career, Mercer felt something she hadn't in years. Not accomplishment, not authority, belonging. She whispered thank you into the breeze, unsure if it was meant for Keanu, her students, or the version of herself she was just beginning to rediscover. And far off, through the library glass, Keanu kept teaching. 3 weeks after the student teaching experiment took off, something unexpected happened. Professor Mercer walked into the office of the department chair with a thick proposal in hand. Printed, annotated, carefully bound. She placed it gently on his desk. "What's this?" he asked, tilting his glasses. She exhaled. "A new curriculum proposal. Collaborative teaching. Student-led problem-solving sessions. Application-first instruction, with an emphasis on real-world context." He blinked. "This? From you?" Mercer didn't smile, but there was light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's time we stopped treating mathematics like a museum piece. It's alive. It should move, shift, adapt." He flipped through a few pages, nodding slowly. "Is this because of Keanu Reeves?" She didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "It's because of what I saw when I let go of my need to control every inch of the room. That's something he taught me, without ever saying it out loud." The chair chuckled. "Well, I'll take a deep look. It's bold, and we need bold." By the end of the week, whispers had turned into meetings. Other professors started peeking into Mercer's class. Some sat in the back under the guise of observation, but stayed longer than they needed to. What they saw was transformation, not just in the students, but in Mercer herself. The class now opened with quick thinking warm-ups. Then students would split into groups, rotate leadership, and present their findings. Mercer would teach the core principles for 10 minutes and then pass it off to Keanu or another student to demonstrate the concept using a real-life metaphor or story. Keanu once used the physics of a skateboard ramp to teach rate of change. Another day, he explained probability through his experience filming action scenes. It was no longer just math. It was connection. A student from the biology department showed up and sat cross-legged near the back. Mercer noticed. "Can I help you?" He stood. "Sorry, I heard you were doing something new here. I'm not a math major, but I wanted to see what it was about." Mercer looked to Keanu. "Care to give him the 5-minute intro?" Keanu nodded and walked over. "What's your field?" "Neuroscience," the student replied. "Perfect. Ever think of the brain as a field of non-linear systems?" The two began to talk. 10 minutes later, another student from music theory quietly entered and sat down. Then, a philosophy student. By midweek, the math class had visitors from 5 departments. Something was happening. And it was magnetic. By the end of the second week of this quiet revolution, Mercer stood at the front of her own classroom and felt something she hadn't in years. Curiosity. Not for math itself, but for the people learning it. Their questions weren't rote. Their eyes didn't glaze over after 10 minutes. They leaned forward. They debated. They sometimes challenged her. And she didn't bristle. She welcomed it. In one of the student-led sessions, Keanu introduced a segment called Math in Motion, where each student picked a movement, any motion from their daily life, and broke it down into vectors, derivatives, or rates of change. One student analyzed her barista job and how the angles of the espresso arm affected pull time. Another dissected a guitar riff, mapping frequency curves and pitch variation. The curving point, glaringly bright, the P. A third stood up and said, "I'm not sure if this counts, but I walk my little brother to school every morning. I notice that we slow down at the same corner every day. Could that be a behavioral function?" The room froze for a moment. Keanu just smiled. "That's one of the most meaningful functions I've heard. Let's graph it." Even Mercer was nodding. Word spread. Professors from the arts and sciences departments wandered in out of curiosity. A chemistry professor asked if she could collaborate on a session about molecular rate equations. A drama instructor stopped Mercer in the hallway and said, "I don't know what you're doing in there, but the students talk about your class like it's a concert." By week 4, Mercer's office had become a space for joint brainstorming. She met with Keanu, the biology TA, and even a graduate student in linguistics to create cross-departmental problem sets. Her whiteboard, once filled only with chalk, straight equations, now included post-it notes that read, "Can we teach topology through dance? Music equals wave functions equals potential bridge? Multiplication equals empathy equals engagement?" It was as though she had rediscovered the subject she thought she had mastered, not through solitude, but through openness. In the faculty lounge, a professor from the economics department sipped his coffee and muttered, "Keanu Reeves may have just saved the math department." Another replied, "No, he reminded it how to breathe." Keanu stayed quiet through it all, still sitting in the back row most days, offering insights only when invited, mentoring when asked, and always redirecting credit away from himself. A reporter from the campus paper reached out for an interview. Keanu politely declined. He suggested they profile one of the students instead. "They're the story," he said. But the momentum couldn't be stopped. Mercer's proposal was approved, pending implementation in the fall. Other departments asked for guest sessions. The once forgotten math lecture hall had become a magnet for ideas, all because someone reminded them that numbers weren't cold, they were human. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Mercer and Keanu stood side by side, watching students fill the once half-empty lecture hall. The new curriculum had officially launched. Gone were the rigid rows and long silences. In their place were clusters of students, some solving equations, some sketching graphs, others arguing passionately about math and music. A whiteboard in the back displayed a question in red marker. "Where have you seen math today? Outside this room?" One student had written, "In my grandmother's sewing patterns." Another, "In the way my sister times her dance moves." And one simply wrote, "And my heart beat." Mercer felt something catch in her throat. At the front, Keanu was setting up a short video clip of satellite rotation to illustrate rotational matrices. A freshman from the music department whispered to her friend, "This is the only class where I don't feel stupid asking questions." And that, Mercer realized, was the legacy she had always wanted. Not prestige, not awards, not being feared, but being remembered as the person who made math feel possible. During a quiet moment, she turned to Keanu. "You know, I used to think rigor meant control, that if I let go, everything would fall apart." He glanced around at the room, buzzing with energy, humming with life. "It didn't fall apart," she said softly. "It became something better." Keanu nodded. "Math didn't change, just the way we invited them into it." As the class settled in, Mercer stepped forward and welcomed them with a warm smile. "Today's topic is vector fields, but you already know more about them than you think." They smiled back. The door stayed open. And outside, in the hallway, a student from the philosophy department peeked in, curious, hesitant. Keanu stood, walked over, and held the door a little wider. The article dropped on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked neatly into the third page of the American Journal of Educational Innovation. Its headline read, "When the Actor Became the Mentor." But it didn't take long for that quiet page to become the loudest whisper on campus. Students rushed to share screenshots, faculty forwarded the link with amused awe, and someone taped a printed copy to the bulletin board outside Hartsdale's math department. The piece was thoughtful. It avoided sensationalism. The journalist, a former mathematics student herself, described the phenomenon at Hartsdale with an academic lens. She detailed how a Hollywood actor had quietly entered an undergraduate classroom, not to steal the spotlight, but to shift it. She wrote about a shy girl who had co-solved an optimization problem, a janitor who now read calculus books on his lunch breaks, and a professor who had once ruled with severity, now sitting beside her students, asking questions as often as she answered them. The quote that captured the most attention came from Mercer herself. It was brief, but it hit with the force of something long buried, now unearthed. "They change more minds than most professors I've known, including mine." Mercer didn't say it for glory. She hadn't known the piece would be widely circulated. When asked by the reporter if she had any reflections on the semester, she had simply spoken from where her walls had cracked open weeks ago. And now, those words reverberated down hallways and across campuses far beyond Hartsdale. The ripple effect was immediate. Other universities emailed inquiries. Department heads asked if the model they'd pioneered, collaborative teaching between unlikely mentors and seasoned educators, might be replicated. One letter stood out among the rest. It came from the Chancellor's office, bearing the official seal of the university. It offered Keanu Reeves an honorary teaching fellowship and a rotating guest lecturer position for the upcoming year. No prerequisites, no obligations, just an open door. The envelope sat unopened on Keanu's desk for 2 days. He had seen the feature, of course. It was impossible not to. Everywhere he walked, heads turned. Students smiled more freely. A few gave subtle nods of respect. Professors who once regarded him as a novelty now approached with genuine curiosity, not condescension. But Keanu remained unchanged, still seated in the back row during lectures, still scribbling in his worn notebook with a calm focus that silenced even the most distracted students. Mercer was the one who finally brought it up. They stood outside the lecture hall after a Friday session, the late afternoon sun casting golden shadows across the stone courtyard. She didn't mention the article directly. Instead, she simply asked, "You going to open it?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I already know what it says." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "And? I'm not here to be a professor," he said. "I'm here to learn." He remained seated. "That's not what they're offering." "I know." She studied him, folding her arms, then looking toward the long hallway where students were still talking about the latest lesson. "Then why not accept it? You've earned it." He considered that. Really considered it. Then, after a moment, he said, "Because the moment I step up to the front permanently, I change the balance. Right now, I represent something they didn't expect, and that unexpectedness is what made them curious, made them open." Mercer didn't push further. She just nodded, strangely comforted by his answer. Later that evening, Keanu stopped by the department office. He returned the unopened envelope with a brief note written on the back. Hartsdale doesn't need another title. It needs more quiet voices who sit in the back row, listening, until someone else dares to speak. He left it on the secretary's desk, then walked out into the evening. The final class of the semester had arrived. The lecture hall buzzed with a strange mix of anticipation and quiet sadness. The seats were filled earlier than usual. No one wanted to miss a second. Some students came dressed a little nicer than normal. Others brought notebooks not to take notes, but to capture a moment they knew would matter. The whiteboard was clean, untouched, waiting. Professor Mercer stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on either side. She scanned the room, then looked toward the back row, his usual seat. Keanu was there, hoodie on, posture relaxed, but eyes sharp and present. The same look he'd worn that very first day. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried weight. "Before we begin, I'd like him to close us out today." Heads turned. A murmur passed through the room. Keanu stood, calm and without hesitation. He stepped down the aisle toward the front, his boots sounding softly against the floor. When he reached the board, he didn't pick up a marker immediately. Instead, he turned to face the students. "I don't have a lecture prepared," he said, "and maybe that's fitting. Because learning, I think, doesn't happen when something is prepared. It happens in the unexpected." Then he picked up a marker and drew a single image in the center of the whiteboard. Spiral. No numbers, no letters, just a simple spiral drawn by hand. He stepped back and pointed at it. "This," Keanu said, "is what math feels like to me." He looked at the students, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle into their curiosity. "Math," he continued, "isn't just numbers. It's the spiral staircase we climb to reach each other." Some students leaned in. "When I walked into this classroom, I thought I'd be sitting back there." He gestured toward the rear seats, just trying to remember how to factor quadratics. "But I ended up learning more about people than equations." He paused. "About how hard it is to ask a question. About what it means to be truly seen when you finally get the courage to ask it." In the front row, one of the shyest students who had rarely spoken all semester blinked rapidly. Another student, a former athlete who used to treat math as a punishment, gave a slow nod. Keanu glanced at Mercer, then turned back to the board. "Every spiral," he said, "starts at a point. It looks small, almost meaningless, but it builds. Every loop is another layer, another insight, another moment of clarity. And that's what learning is." He tapped the center of the spiral gently. "We start not knowing anything. Then someone says something kind, or explains something clearly, or just gives us space to be confused, without shame. And the spiral grows." He dropped his hand. "You've all helped me grow this semester." A few students smiled. Others blinked back sudden emotion. No one moved. The room was still. He looked at the sea of faces before him, each one quiet, expectant, holding their breath. Slowly, he reached up to the chalkboard and drew a spiral. Nothing fancy, just a soft swirl of white against black. "Math," Keanu said gently, "isn't just numbers. It's the spiral staircase we climb to reach each other. Every equation, every graph, every symbol. It's a language, not of separation, but of connection. The kind of connection that says, 'You're not alone in this.'" No one moved. He took a step back and let his fingers trace the chalk dust on his hands, as if grounding himself in the past months. "When I walked into this classroom," he continued, "I didn't know what I was seeking. But I found something more powerful than knowledge. I found people who believed they weren't capable, weren't smart enough, weren't good enough. And I wanted to be the quiet nudge that said, 'Yes, you are.'" One of the students in the front row wiped her eyes. Another, in the back, lowered his head, overwhelmed. Keanu's voice stayed steady, but there was a softness that made each word feel like a note in a song written just for them. "I'm not a professor, I never claimed to be. But every time one of you stayed after class to ask a question you were scared to voice, or when you leaned over to help someone else with a step they didn't understand, I saw learning, I saw courage, and I saw the kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on test scores, but changes the world anyway." He looked down for a moment, then up again, scanning the rows. "You may forget the formulas, that's okay. You may forget the diagrams or the lectures, but I hope you remember this feeling, the one you have now. The realization that you belong here, that your mind is capable of beauty, and that every struggle you've had to understand was worth it." Keanu paused. Then he smiled, small and genuine. He turned back to the spiral on the chalkboard. "This," he said, tapping the chalk to its center, "is where we all begin. Confused, intimidated, lost. But if we keep moving outward, keep circling forward, every loop becomes a step upward, and eventually, we see the pattern not just in math, but in life." He set the chalk down and looked to Professor Mercer. "I came here thinking I had nothing left to learn. I was wrong." The room was utterly silent. Professor Mercer stepped forward. She didn't speak at first. Her face was tight with emotion. But then she simply said, "Mr. Reeves, thank you." Without any cue, every student in the room rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall, raw and honest. Some students clapped through tears. Others just stood still, trying to hold the moment in their hearts. Keanu gave a slight bow. Then, unexpectedly, Mercer moved beside him. Together, wordlessly, they bowed in unison. The spiral on the board stood glowing in the sunlight breaking through the tall windows, as if the universe had blessed this goodbye. In that moment, a simple farewell lecture became something else, something unforgettable. A closing, yes, but also a beginning. By the start of the next semester, whispers had already begun. Freshman orientation groups passed through the math wing of Hartsdale University, pausing briefly outside room 27. A few pointed to the far corner of the lecture hall. "That seat," one student murmured. That was Keanu Reeves's seat. No one knew exactly how the rumor had started, but no one doubted it. The legend spread faster than the course catalog. Students who had once dreaded advanced mathematics now leaned forward in curiosity. The classroom wasn't just a room anymore. It was a place where something had happened, something real, something human. More than just gossip, Keanu's influence began to shape the culture of the university itself. Professor Mercer, once seen as the toughest and most intimidating instructor in the department, began the semester with something new. A framed quote hung beside the board, where every student could see it. See the shape, understand the pattern, share the knowledge. No attribution, no fanfare, just quiet inspiration. The quote came from a chalkboard exercise Keanu had once used to explain recursive symmetry. It wasn't meant to be profound, just helpful. But now, it lived on as a motto. Mercer's lectures still held her signature precision. But something had shifted. She paused longer when students hesitated. She asked more open-ended questions. And most of all, she encouraged students to teach each other during problem-solving sessions. She even began training new faculty members with a new term, compassionate rigor. She explained it like this: hold your students to the highest standard, but walk beside them, not in front. It wasn't about making things easier. It was about making understanding possible. As word spread, more faculty adopted the approach. Some departments borrowed the language directly. The music theory department created a cross-discipline seminar titled The Pattern and the Pulse. The biology department renamed a course Mathematical Models in Nature and invited Mercer to guest lecture. Suddenly, math wasn't a silo. It was a bridge. The mural appeared just before midterms. It started as a project in the student art club, a quiet initiative led by two undergrads from the philosophy department who had both taken Mercer's class. One had failed calculus twice before. The other had dropped out of linear algebra. But they'd sat near Keanu that semester, watched him listen more than he spoke, and they'd learned something more valuable than formulas. They called the mural The Pattern Shared. Painted on the outer wall of the mathematics building, the scene was simple but powerful. Mercer and Keanu stood shoulder to shoulder beside a chalkboard. The board displayed 3 clean lines of chalk. See the shape, understand the pattern, share the knowledge. The mural drew immediate attention. Students stopped and stared on their way to class. Some took photos. Others touched the brick, as if the paint held some of the spirit they'd heard about. No one vandalized it. No one mocked it. Even the seniors, who usually scoffed at anything sentimental, seemed to respect it. It wasn't just about Keanu. It was about what he represented. A man with no formal training had walked into one of the most complex classrooms on campus, asked questions without shame, and in doing so gave others permission to be curious. His presence had turned fear into fascination. By the end of the year, first-year students could be heard quoting him without ever having met him. A girl waiting nervously before her oral exam in number theory whispered to herself, "Everyone's smart. They just need the right path." It had become a mantra. Mercer noticed, of course, but she never called attention to it. She just nodded quietly when a student tried a second time. When someone explained a concept to their neighbor instead of waiting for her to do it, she smiled faintly. She knew the culture had shifted. And Keanu's seat? No one sat in it, not officially. Unspoken tradition. But once in a while, a student having a rough week would quietly take that seat, as if it held courage. No one teased them. Everyone understood. It had become sacred space. One late afternoon in spring, Mercer hosted an informal faculty circle on the quad lawn. A few new professors, still finding their rhythm, had expressed interest in her compassionate rigor style. She didn't use slides, didn't lecture. She just sat on the grass with them and shared stories. She told them about the time Keanu helped a student understand topology by referencing a spiral staircase in a lighthouse. About how he'd once stayed after class to help a student explain a mistake, not hide from it. About how humility could be a tool for instruction, not a weakness. A young professor raised her hand, unsure. But how do we balance high standards with this kind of openness? Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured toward the mural. Set the bar high, she said, but never build a wall in front of it. Build a bridge. That answer stayed with them. A year later, new syllabi included collaborative problem sets. Office hours were renamed Math Cafe in one course. One professor held open mic nights where students explained how they solved a problem, not just what the answer was. Change was slow, but it was real. And every freshman who passed the mural in orientation would hear some version of the same whispered legend. That's where Keanu sat? That mural? Yeah, the actor. But he didn't act here. He listened. He changed the math department. In some corners, it felt exaggerated, mythologized. But the impact wasn't measured in celebrity or headlines. It was in the number of students who stayed in their math courses instead of dropping them. The ones who raised their hands without fear. The janitor, who now tutored students after hours. The senior, who switched majors because, as she wrote in her essay, I saw someone who believed math could heal. Keanu never came back to speak. He never signed the mural, never gave interviews about it. But once on a gray Sunday morning, Mercer was walking through campus when she spotted a man in a hoodie and jeans, hands in his pockets, standing quietly in front of the mural. He didn't speak, just looked. She didn't call out to him. She simply smiled and walked on. Some stories don't need to be retold to stay alive. They breathe in chalk dust and laughter, in murals and quiet gestures, in the soft courage of a question asked for the first time. The legend of the man in the back row was no longer about fame. It was about permission, to wonder, to fail, to rise again, and to teach. Not just from the front of the class, but from the seat beside someone who doesn't yet believe they belong. That was the real equation, and Hartsdale would carry it forward, one question at a time. The campus had quieted. Even the wind seemed respectful as it moved through the leaves that lined the stone paths of Hartsdale University. Night had settled, casting a soft silver glow on the old brick buildings. In the heart of it all stood the math building, its tall windows still glowing faintly, long after classes had ended. Keanu walked alone beneath the street lamps. His steps were slow, unhurried. There was no audience, no camera, no one waiting for him to arrive. And still, every step carried weight, memory, meaning. He stopped beneath the building's archway and looked up. Those windows. He used to sit behind them, quiet, unnoticed. Just another figure at the back of the class. That seat hadn't changed, but he had. The man who once came to learn something for himself had ended up helping others see themselves differently. The janitor, who thought he'd never understand calculus, now held weekly tutoring sessions for students afraid to speak up. A senior who once doubted her ability had changed her major and was preparing for graduate school. Professors who once saw teaching as a performance had begun inviting students to become part of the lesson itself. Mercer now taught with laughter in her voice and grace in her hands. She no longer erased mistakes off the board as if they were stains. She circled them, showed their value, let them live a moment longer so students could learn without shame. Keanu's journal was full now. Every page. Scribbled formulas, metaphors, questions, sketches of spirals, diagrams explained with coffee spoons and carpet edges. There were no grades inside, only effort, curiosity, and patience. He had never meant to leave a legacy. He had only wanted to learn. But maybe, sometimes, learning quietly is what creates the loudest change. Earlier that evening, a first-year student had walked into the math building for the first time. She hadn't meant to. Her major was literature. Numbers scared her. They always had. But she'd overheard something strange in the dining hall. Two biology students talking excitedly about the back row miracle man. One had said, "He showed me the pattern in protein chains through the Fibonacci sequence. I actually understood it, in one conversation." The other had laughed. "The guy's a myth. Mercer swears he saved her teaching career. She tells us to teach like Keanu now." Curious, the student wandered to the math wing. She found herself standing before a mural. It wasn't large or loud, just a painted image of Keanu standing beside Professor Mercer, both smiling in front of a chalkboard. The board bore only 3 lines. See the shape, understand the pattern, share the knowledge. Below it, in small print, "In memory of one transformative semester." She stood there for a while, not because she knew who he was, but because the mural didn't feel like an award. It felt like an invitation. Back on the stone path, Keanu walked further until he reached the bench across from the fountain. The same bench where Mercer had once thrown a book beside him in frustration, swearing she was done with the system. Now she trained new faculty on how to reach hearts, not just test scores. Compassionate rigor, they called it. He sat down. The wind rustled gently through the ivy behind him. Somewhere nearby, students laughed. A guitar played a few soft notes. Late-night conversations trickled out of dorm windows, filled with equations, poetry, ambition, and caffeine. The campus was alive, and yet peaceful. Keanu opened the leather-bound journal Mercer had gifted him, the one filled with her chalkboard notes, preserved page by page. On the last page, she had written something by hand, to the man who taught us that presence can teach louder than any voice. He closed the book. He didn't need to write anything else. In the distance, the lights of the math building flickered once, then settled into stillness. Some rooms are built for competition, for egos, for fear of failure. But sometimes, when the right people enter, when walls are softened and mistakes are welcomed, those rooms become sanctuaries. Sanctuaries for second chances, for rediscovery, for becoming who we were too afraid to believe we could be. Keanu rose from the bench. He took one last look at the campus, the way an artist steps back from a canvas not to admire it, but to make sure it no longer needs another stroke. Then he turned and walked away, not as someone who had changed the university, but as someone it had changed, in return, because that too was part of the pattern. What you give returns, what you heal teaches, and what you love, especially quietly, endures far longer than applause. Weeks later, a freshman orientation guide paused in front of the math building mural. She pointed toward the painted faces. "That seat right there," she said, gesturing toward the simple wooden bench by the ivy wall, was where Keanu Reeves used to sit. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Never missed a class. The student asked, "What was he doing here? Was it for a movie?" The guide smiled. "Nope, he was learning, like us. Said math helped him see the world again." Another student leaned in. "Did he ever teach?" "Not officially," the guide replied, "but he changed how a whole department teaches now." Just beyond the group, Mercer walked past unnoticed. She didn't correct them, she just smiled. In her office, she kept the original spiral he'd drawn on the board that day, framed, unlabeled. She never spoke of it, but students who entered her class said something had shifted. She no longer graded with red ink. She no longer stood behind the desk. She sat in the circle, asked questions with the same curiosity she once thought she had to hide. Every semester she opened with the same phrase, "Let's find the pattern together." And slowly, her classroom stopped fearing mistakes. Instead, it embraced momentum. In quiet dorm rooms, students from music, physics, and philosophy solved problems together. They used colors, metaphors, sound waves, even origami, all ways to translate math into meaning. One student called it the Keanu method. It wasn't about equations. It was about seeing. On the wall near the staircase leading to the lecture hall, a sticky note remained from the previous semester. It read in careful handwriting, "I failed calc twice. Then Keanu sat near me. And somehow, I believed again." No one ever removed the note. It was renewed each semester, rewritten word for word by a new student who wanted it to stay. Outside the math building, beneath a maple tree, the bench still stood. People left small chalk pieces on it, neatly lined. Some came just to sit there in silence, to breathe, to think, to feel something shift. At the back of the library, Mercer placed a second copy of the journal she had made for Keanu, bound in the same leather, filled with the same chalkboard pages. But this one had an inscription at the front. For the reader who needs to remember that, understanding begins with listening. And slowly the university changed. Not in banners, not in announcements, but in the heartbeat of the place. In the way a question was asked. In the way a wrong answer was met with encouragement, not shame. In the way eyes lit up when someone saw a connection they hadn't before. Students no longer feared the math building. They stayed longer after class. They talked in groups instead of studying alone. They started believing their minds were capable of more than grades could show. And all of it from a man who sat in the back row, never once taking credit, never once needing applause, only offering presence, offering belief, and reminding an entire generation what education was always meant to be, not a gatekeeping structure, but an open path, one that spirals upward and makes room for everyone to climb. Call to action, Sita. Have you ever had a teacher who changed everything for you? Someone who didn't just teach the subject, but helped you believe in yourself again? It's type "I believe in second chances" if this story moved you. And tell us in the comments, what incredible story should Keanu live next? Your voice matters. Let's keep building a world where knowledge is shared, compassion is loud, and even the quietest seat in the back row can change everything. See you in the next story.